George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, was born into one of the most turbulent periods in English history, a time defined by blood feuds, shifting allegiances, and dynastic paranoia. As the third surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville George was not destined for the throne, yet he would grow dangerously close to it. His birth in 1449 placed him squarely between two towering siblings, the future Edward IV and the future Richard III. These three brothers would each in their own way reshape the course of the English crown, but George's path was arguably the most erratic and the most disturbing. By the time George reached adolescence, the Wars of the Roses had fractured the English nobility. The Plantagenets, split between the houses of Lancaster and York, fought bitterly for the throne, each claiming legitimate succession through rival branches of Edward III's progeny, Richard, Duke of York. George's father laid an aggressive claim to the crown, contesting the feeble reign of Henry VI. When Richard was killed at Wakefield in 1460, his eldest son Edward picked up the Yorkist cause and would soon ascend to the throne as Edward the Far. George, just 11 years old at the time, was quickly drawn into the machinations of court politics. The dynamics within the Yorkist household were complex even before the crown was won. Cecily Neville, a formidable matriarch known as the Rose of Raby, instilled ambition and martial pride in her sons. Yet among the three brothers, George was always the least secure. Edward's military prowess and charisma made him the natural leader, while Richard's loyalty and effectiveness on the battlefield made him indispensable. George, in contrast, showed an early proclivity for discontent. His personal charm masked a brooding ambition and a tendency toward conspiratorial thinking qualities that would later come to define his political missteps. After Edward's coronation in 1461, George was elevated to the peerage as Duke of Clarence and granted substantial estates. At 16, he stood as a symbol of Yorkist legitimacy, a youthful embodiment of Edward's new order. Yet even in these early years, George began cultivating ties that suggested restlessness. He gravitated toward powerful nobles, discontented with Edward's increasingly centralized rule, most notably Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, Edward's former ally known to history as the Kingmaker. Warwick's relationship with Edward had begun to sour, particularly after Edward's unpopular marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. The queen of comparatively humble birth brought with her a large and ambitious family, threatening the entrenched noble networks Warwick had relied upon. George, sensing an opportunity, aligned himself with Warwick's grievances. This alliance was not merely political, it was familial. In 1469, George married Warwick's daughter Isabel Neville, without Edward's approval, a defiant gesture that hinted at deeper ambitions. The marriage was controversial not only because it defied the king's wishes, but because it aligned George with a faction openly contemplating rebellion. Warwick envisioned a future where Clarence, his son-in-law, might sit on the throne in Edward's place. For George, who had always chafed at playing second to his elder brother, the idea proved irresistible. He began engaging in schemes that questioned the legitimacy of Edward's rule, lending tacit support to uprisings orchestrated by Warwick in the north of England. One of the more disturbing aspects of this period was George's early willingness to exploit popular superstition and political unrest. He allowed rumors to circulate that Edward was illegitimate, born not of Richard of York, but of an unknown archer, an insidious claim that not only undermined Edward's right to rule, but implicitly elevated George's own claim. By fueling such narratives, George revealed a cold-blooded readiness to destabilize the realm for personal advancement. At the same time, his actions lacked the strategic discipline needed to succeed in the violent world of 15th century politics. He vacillated between bold moves and hesitant retreats, often relying on others, especially Warwick, to do the heavy lifting. When Warwick launched a full-scale rebellion in 1469, George supported him, but failed to capitalize on the momentum. Despite their early victories, including the temporary capture and execution of the king's father-in-law Richard Woodville, the rebellion collapsed amid infighting and logistical failures. In the aftermath, Edward displayed magnanimity. Rather than executing his brother, he offered forgiveness, hoping to preserve unity among the House of York. George's titles and lands were restored, and for a brief period the brothers presented a united front. But the damage was done. The seeds of mistrust had taken root, and George's repeated flirtation with treason had made his position precarious. What perhaps went unnoticed at the time but would prove significant later was George's growing detachment from reality. Contemporaries noted his increasing interest in astrology, prophecy, and signs, particularly those that might suggest a divine mandate for his own rule. He reportedly consulted mystics and charlatans searching for omens that Edward's reign was doomed. Though this was not unusual in an age where celestial phenomena often dictated royal policy, George's behavior stood out for its intensity. He became convinced that he was destined for a greater role even as his actual influence waned. This fascination with the occult was more than idle curiosity. It reflected a psychological need to justify his failures and grievances, an early signal of the delusions that would later dominate his actions. In an era where political survival required ruthless pragmatism, George increasingly resorted to magical thinking. It was a dangerous turn, one that blurred the line between ambition and self-destruction. The decade that followed would see George oscillate between rebellion and reconciliation, each turn bringing him closer to ruin. His story was no longer merely that of a disappointed prince, but of a man unraveling within the very court he once hoped to command. The forces that shaped George, the violence of civil war, the suffocating expectations of royal blood, the treacherous allure of power were closing in, and he would not escape them. The mid-1460s marked a critical juncture in the life of George, Duke of Clarence. His marriage to Isabel Neville had drawn him into the orbit of her father, the Earl of Warwick, a man once indispensable to Edward IV, now increasingly alienated by the king's policies and household. Warwick's dissatisfaction centered on Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, which he viewed not only as a personal slight, but as a political betrayal. The Queen's large and ambitious Woodville family were awarded plum titles and court positions, displacing the long-standing influence of the Neville network. Warwick's response was to craft an alternative power bloc, and George Clarence was his linchpin. Initially, the alliance between George and Warwick was held together by mutual resentment. George chafed at his exclusion from Edward's inner circle and resented the Woodville ascendancy. Warwick, for his part, saw in George a potential puppet, a royal of unimpeachable blood who could be elevated to the throne under his control. By marrying Isabel Neville without Edward's permission in Calais in July 1469, George cemented this alliance. It was a bold defiance of royal authority, one that Edward could not ignore. Yet for all his fury, the king hesitated to retaliate with full force. The bond of brotherhood, even under stress, still carried weight. Warwick and George launched a coordinated rebellion shortly after the wedding. In the north, armed risings were incited under the guise of popular discontent with economic mismanagement. In reality, these were meticulously planned assaults on the legitimacy of Edward's rule. They culminated in the capture of Edward IV at the Battle of Edgecote Moor in July 1469. Warwick then executed the king's chief allies, including William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and John Woodville, the Queen's brother. These acts of targeted violence were intended to clear the path for Clarence's rise. But rather than seize the moment, George faltered. He lacked the political instincts necessary to consolidate power. The nobility, though critical of Edward, were wary of installing George, who had shown himself to be impulsive and potentially unstable. Warwick was forced to release Edward just months later. The Yorkist king regained control with startling speed, reasserting his authority with a wave of arrests and reconciliations. Publicly, Edward offered pardon to both Warwick and Clarence, hoping to avoid another bloody conflict. But beneath the surface, trust had been irrevocably shattered. For George, this reconciliation was a bitter pill. He had risked everything: his title, his standing, even his life on a scheme that had failed. The court, now more than ever dominated by Woodvilles, and wary nobles regarded him with suspicion. Even his restored status did not grant him real influence. He was to many a prince who had already betrayed his own blood. Warwick, too, found himself adrift. No longer trusted by Edward and unable to control George, he turned to a drastic alternative reconciliation with the Lancastrians. This decision, stunning in its audacity, would drag George further into a web of intrigue. In 1470, Warwick made contact with Margaret of Anjou, wife of the deposed Henry VI. The former enemies formed an unlikely alliance to restore the Lancastrian line. In a cynical twist, Warwick offered his younger daughter Anne Neville to Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, in marriage. This meant George's position as Warwick's favored royal son-in-law was now diminished. With Anne pledged to the Lancastrians, Warwick had little use for Clarence as a claimant to the throne. George was furious. He had in effect been used and discarded. What little trust he had placed in Warwick evaporated. In response, he realigned himself with Edward IV in 1471. This time his return was conditional. Edward needed Clarence's forces to defeat Warwick and the Lancastrian resurgence, and George knew it. Yet even in this renewed alliance, Edward kept his brother at arm's length. While George fought loyally at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, decisive Yorkist victories, he was not restored to his former influence. The return of Edward to the throne did not equate to the return of harmony. George's participation in the decisive battles had been crucial. At Barnet, Warwick was killed. At Tewkesbury, Prince Edward of Westminster was slain, and Henry VI would soon follow, likely murdered in the Tower. The Lancastrian threat had been annihilated, but the price was steep bloodshed, fratricide, and the crumbling of any remaining bonds of family unity. The psychological toll of these events is difficult to quantify, but it is clear that George emerged from them increasingly unmoored. His expectations for reward for trust for supremacy within the Yorkist hierarchy were not met. Edward IV's second reign was colder, more calculating. Though he restored George's title as Duke of Clarence and allowed him to keep his lands, he refused to grant him the extensive political power he craved. And crucially, Edward blocked George from pursuing further advantageous marriages or foreign alliances. These limitations rankled. Clarence's paranoia deepened. He resented the elevation of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his younger brother, who was entrusted with military command in the north, and married Anne Neville, George's own sister-in-law. Clarence saw himself increasingly boxed in, hemmed by courtiers he despised, and a monarch he no longer understood. The gulf between his royal blood and his lack of authority became an obsession. One of the more disturbing episodes during this period involved Clarence's use of astrology to try to divine his future. He became convinced that his path to the crown was not yet closed, relying on the murky interpretations of court astrologers who claimed that a man with the initial G would succeed Edward IV. Clarence believed, or chose to believe, that this prophecy referred to him. In an age where such predictions were treated with deadly seriousness, the rumors began to circulate with renewed intensity. Even Edward reportedly grew anxious. The atmosphere around George thickened with suspicion. Every action, every conversation was monitored. The court whispered of Clarence's renewed interest in sedition. His servants were questioned, his correspondences scrutinized. George had become a political liability, but also a familial one. No ordinary traitor, he was the king's own brother. A prince by birth, yet a conspirator in deed. That contradiction would soon reach its inevitable conclusion. George's decision to marry Isabel Neville in open defiance of Edward IV's will had already marked a turning point in his political trajectory. But the true collapse of his fortunes began when that marriage became a platform for open rebellion. With Warwick now disillusioned and unmoored from Edward's authority, George willingly became a central figure in an audacious scheme to replace the sitting king with himself. His sense of entitlement, fanned by both familial prestige and Warwick's manipulation, overcame any lingering loyalty. The backdrop for this betrayal was a kingdom weary of instability. Though Edward IV had restored a measure of peace after his ascension, discontent festered beneath the surface. Noble families felt alienated by the rise of the Woodvilles, whom many regarded as opportunists with no long-standing noble heritage. Into this environment stepped Warwick, who still commanded loyalty in parts of the realm. His alliance with George Clarence was both opportunistic and strategic. George supplied the royal blood, Warwick the military muscle. By the winter of 1469 to 1470, their alliance had begun to crystallize into a serious threat. Together, they orchestrated a campaign of disinformation and armed rebellion. George, encouraged by Warwick, began spreading the claim that Edward was illegitimate, born not of Richard, Duke of York, but from an affair between Cecily Neville and an archer named Blayborn. This libelous rumor wasn't just idle court gossip, it was designed to delegitimize Edward's entire claim to the throne. That Clarence was willing to endorse such slander against his own mother spoke volumes about his growing detachment from familial bonds and ethical boundaries. While Edward retained the support of many powerful nobles, the alliance between George and Warwick was too potent to ignore. Their forces seized parts of the Midlands, and Warwick's supporters managed to capture Edward briefly in 1469. But their victory was short-lived. Clarence's reluctance or inability to assume leadership left the coup floundering. Lacking the charisma or decisiveness to rally support, he became a liability even to his allies. The nobility, alarmed by the rapid deterioration of order and the possibility of civil war, began withdrawing support. Edward, regaining control, was released and returned to London with the tacit support of many former rebels. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in the Wars of the Roses. Clarence, now politically stranded, rejoined Edward while Warwick fled abroad. George was pardoned once again under circumstances that bewildered contemporaries. It was clear that Edward valued the appearance of unity above all, or perhaps he hoped that blood ties could still be redeemed. Yet neither interpretation fully explains the king's willingness to overlook a conspiracy that had not only endangered his crown but cast doubts upon his very lineage. For a time, George appeared to reconcile with Edward, but the peace was fragile. Within months, Warwick returned to England, this time with an even more astonishing partner, Margaret of Anjou. The queen consort of Henry VI, once Warwick's bitter enemy, now aligned herself with him in an attempt to restore her husband and son to the throne. Their reconciliation was marked by the marriage of Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, to Prince Edward of Westminster. This move had direct consequences for Clarence. Not only was he supplanted as Warwick's political heir, but his own influence over the Neville inheritance through Isabel was now contested by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would soon marry Anne. The final breach between George and Warwick came swiftly. Outraged at being sidelined, Clarence now sought a return to Edward's favor. His motivations were deeply personal. The removal of Anne's inheritance from his orbit, the weakening of his Neville alliance, and the humiliation of being passed over drove him into a furious bid for restoration. He wrote to Edward disavowing Warwick and offering military support to defeat the Lancastrians. Edward, facing the combined threat of Warwick and Margaret, accepted. In the spring of 1471, Edward returned from exile in Burgundy and launched a lightning campaign. With George's assistance, he crushed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. George's betrayal was complete. He had helped destroy the man who once promised him a crown. Then, just weeks later, Clarence fought at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where the Lancastrian heir, Edward of Westminster, was slain. Henry VI, aged and mentally broken, was murdered in the Tower of London within days. The Lancastrian cause had been obliterated. Yet, even in this apparent victory, Clarence found himself at odds with his brother. During the post-war settlements, Edward was careful to reward his most loyal supporters, among them Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard's marriage to Anne Neville gave him a legitimate claim to half the Warwick inheritance. George, who had expected the entire Neville fortune through Isabel, now faced an internal family dispute over land and prestige. This set off a bitter feud between the two younger brothers, one that exposed the fragility of Yorkist unity. Edward attempted to mediate, but his efforts were complicated by George's increasingly erratic behavior. The Duke had grown suspicious of all those around him. He questioned the loyalty of his household, berated allies who failed to support his claims, and accused courtiers of conspiring against him. His paranoia found a new focus in his wife's fertility and health. Isabel Neville had suffered multiple miscarriages, and Clarence began to believe that their household had been infiltrated by enemies using witchcraft or poison. The most disturbing indicator of George's mental deterioration came in 1476, when Isabel died after giving birth to a son who also perished shortly after. Clarence, devastated, became obsessed with the idea that his wife had been murdered. His grief transformed into rage, and he set out to exact revenge not through law, but through vengeance cloaked in judicial language. His first target was Ankerette Twinnyho, one of Isabel's gentlewomen. Clarence accused her of poisoning the Duchess. Without waiting for proper legal proceedings, he had Twinnyho arrested, tried in a manipulated court, and hanged within 3 days. The process was so flagrantly illegal that it shocked even those accustomed to summary justice. Not only had Twinnyho been taken from her home without cause, but the trial was held under Clarence's direct pressure in defiance of the king's authority. This moment, while perhaps seen by Clarence as righteous retribution, marked a point of no return. He had executed a subject of the realm without royal warrant, an act tantamount to treasonous overreach. Edward, who had long tolerated his brother's transgressions, began to view him not merely as a political rival, but as a destabilizing force. The court, already weary of Clarence's erratic behavior, now saw him as a man capable of bypassing the law for personal vendettas. Ironically, the very traits that had once made Clarence a threat, his lineage, his ambition, his popular name, were now liabilities. He had exhausted the patience of a monarch who understood better than most the importance of centralized control. George had alienated both Warwick and Edward, gambled with foreign alliances, and now stood alone, increasingly convinced that shadowy enemies plotted against him. And in a sense, he was right, though not for the reasons he believed. By 1476, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, had become an increasingly unstable figure at the heart of Edward IV's realm. Though he still held his title and his lands, his actions had transformed him into a dangerous liability. His judicial murder of Anchoret Twiniho, conducted without the king's consent and against all precedent, was an unmistakable challenge to royal authority. But even this was not an isolated incident. It was one in a string of behaviors that exposed Clarence's descent into a perilous mixture of arrogance, paranoia, and self-delusion. After Isabel Neville's death, Clarence's grip on reality seemed to weaken further. His mourning gave way not to solemn withdrawal, but to erratic behavior and renewed political maneuvering. One of the first signs of his persistent ambition reemerged in his attempts to remarry strategically. He cast his eye on Mary of Burgundy, heiress to one of the most powerful territories in Europe. Such a marriage would have dramatically increased Clarence's wealth and international influence. Edward IV, however, flatly refused to grant his consent. The king recognized that such an alliance, if realized, could tilt the balance of power away from the crown and give Clarence the leverage to pursue independent ambitions. Edward's refusal was rooted in more than personal mistrust. He understood the nature of continental politics and feared that a Clarence-Burgundy union could position George as a rival king in all but name. Clarence's anger at this denial was immediate and intense. He began attacking Edward's ministers in private conversation, casting suspicion on their motives, and hinting once again that the king's legitimacy was not above reproach. The court was filled with whispers fueled by George himself, who seemed bent on recasting his brother's reign as a reign of usurpation and injustice. The king could no longer afford to ignore him. Yet Edward moved cautiously. Openly arresting or punishing a prince of the blood, his own brother, risked scandal and potential rebellion. Clarence still commanded loyalty among certain segments of the nobility and gentry, especially those disillusioned with the Woodville faction. But rather than confront Clarence directly, Edward allowed pressure to build in more subtle ways. Clarence's requests were delayed or ignored. His retainers were quietly reassigned. His agents found themselves under increasing scrutiny. The tipping point came with the case of Thomas Burdett, a member of Clarence's household. In 1477, Burdett was accused of treason for allegedly producing seditious prophecies and expressing wishes for the king's death. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was a comment made in relation to a white stag, a symbol often associated with Edward that Burdett hoped would run his last course. Though seemingly trivial, such remarks were not taken lightly in an era when coded speech and prophecy could be interpreted as incitement. Burdett's execution was swift, but Clarence's reaction to it proved catastrophic. Outraged by what he saw as a deliberate provocation by the crown, he took the extraordinary step of interrupting a meeting of the king's council to publicly defend Burdett and denounce the trial as fraudulent. Worse, he presented documents likely forged or altered intended to exonerate Burdett and implicate members of the king's household in treachery. This public confrontation marked the end of Edward's patience. Clarence had not merely overstepped his authority, he had done so in open court in front of peers and counselors. His accusations challenged the legal integrity of royal justice and threatened to unravel the very structure of Edward's rule. Days later, Clarence was arrested at Westminster and confined to the Tower of London. The arrest sent shockwaves through the realm. For a royal duke to be imprisoned by his own brother was an act of exceptional gravity. Edward moved swiftly to control the narrative. He issued official statements detailing Clarence's repeated transgressions, not just the murder of Anchoret Twiniho, but a pattern of illegal trials, unauthorized punishments, seditious speech, and attempts to undermine the authority of the crown. The charges were meticulously laid out, building a picture of Clarence as a man who had consistently placed his personal ambition above the good of the realm. Behind closed doors, however, the situation was more complex. Some members of Edward's council hesitated to endorse a full prosecution. Executing a prince, especially a brother, was a dangerous precedent. It could sow division in the royal family and embolden enemies abroad. But others, particularly those aligned with the Woodvilles, pressed for decisive action. They argued that Clarence, having already betrayed the crown once with Warwick, could not be trusted to remain within the royal structure. His past disloyalties and present delusions rendered him a long-term threat. Edward's decision to proceed with charges against his brother was made quietly but deliberately. Parliament was convened in January 1478, and the process began under a shroud of secrecy. Clarence was not given a public trial. Instead, the proceedings were held in the House of Lords, where evidence was presented in controlled, limited fashion. Clarence was denied legal counsel and did not speak in his own defense. His fate had already been sealed. The charges were not just legal, but psychological. Clarence was accused of sowing sedition, engaging in unauthorized legal action, consulting astrologers and diviners for political gain, and most damningly attempting to usurp the authority of the king by judicially killing the innocent. These accusations painted a picture not only of political treachery, but of a mind unhinged by ambition and paranoia. Throughout the proceedings, Edward remained silent. When the Lords reached their verdict, guilty of treason, the king still hesitated. It would take him several more weeks to sign the execution warrant. According to some sources, the decision haunted him. Edward had fought rebellions and punished traitors before, but this was different. Clarence was not an enemy of the state in the traditional sense. He was a brother, a former ally, and a man whose worst sins were magnified by personal instability. Still, the king could not ignore the cumulative weight of Clarence's offenses. He had threatened the stability of the realm not once but repeatedly, and always at moments of crisis. He had manipulated public opinion, tried to elevate himself through marriage and slander, and committed extrajudicial killings. His very presence at court had become an insult to royal governance. What remains particularly disturbing about this stage in Clarence's downfall is the growing sense of inevitability that surrounded it. His fate was no longer the result of a singular misstep, but of a long, unraveling pattern, a descent from princely ambition to dangerous instability. And despite Edward's personal reluctance, the machinery of state was now in motion. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence awaited. The only question remaining was how it would be carried out. The psychological decline of George, Duke of Clarence, reached its most disquieting depths in the wake of his wife Isabel's death. While court physicians attributed her passing to complications from childbirth, Clarence saw something far more sinister: deliberate poisoning. His belief was not rooted in evidence, but in a growing pattern of delusion that had begun to shape every facet of his perception. The court, long accustomed to Clarence's political volatility, now confronted a man deeply unraveling, paranoid, erratic, and consumed by conspiratorial thinking. What had begun as a public display of grief rapidly spiraled into accusations. Clarence identified members of Isabel's household as suspects, among them Oncaretta Twinihoe, a senior attendant and trusted servant. Without consulting any judicial body, and in a direct violation of royal authority, Clarence ordered Twinihoe's abduction from her home in Somerset. She was dragged more than 200 miles to Warwick, subjected to a hasty and manipulated trial, and hanged within 3 days. The speed and violence of the proceedings stunned contemporaries. The irregularity of the case was striking not only for its brutality, but for the glaring absence of legal justification. There was no warrant, no jury of peers, and no evidence beyond Clarence's word. Twinihoe's execution was not an act of justice, it was a personal vendetta carried out under the cloak of ducal power. Even by the loose standards of late medieval justice, the event stood out as grotesquely irregular. Edward IV was reportedly horrified when informed. Not only had Clarence usurped the king's judicial prerogative, but he had also executed a woman without the semblance of due process, an affront to the crown and to the concept of law itself. But Clarence's descent did not stop there. Convinced that a larger conspiracy was afoot, he began investigating other members of his household in court. He believed he was surrounded by spies and assassins, many of them allegedly loyal to the Woodvilles or other factions he viewed as hostile. In his own mind, he was a prince under siege, his wife murdered by hidden hands, his enemies encircling him with poison and slander. This siege mentality became the dominant force in his decision-making, and it increasingly detached him from reality. His behavior became erratic and performative. At court, Clarence would sometimes appear disheveled, his clothing unkempt, his eyes sunken and ringed with fatigue. He reportedly muttered to himself and kept odd hours, sometimes pacing his chamber deep into the night. At other times he behaved with manic energy, proposing policies and alliances that had no grounding in current political reality. He demanded access to foreign envoys and sought private meetings with foreign ambassadors despite being formally excluded from such affairs. It was during this period that he revived his old fascination with astrology and divination. Court observers noted that Clarence once again began consulting with astrologers, searching for signs that Edward's reign would soon end, and that a man with the initial G would rule England. The prophecy, long dismissed by most as harmless fantasy, now took on more dangerous connotations. Clarence interpreted it as divine confirmation of his destiny. Edward, still technically the most powerful man in the kingdom, became more than just an obstacle. He became a usurper in the eyes of a brother who saw himself as preordained. The court was increasingly unsettled by Clarence's erratic behavior. Though mental illness was not understood in modern terms, contemporaries recognized signs of instability. Clarence no longer functioned as a reliable peer or advisor. His outbursts were unpredictable and his accusations bordered on delusional. Servants began avoiding his presence. Nobles declined invitations to his home. Even his own children were reportedly kept at a distance for fear of his moods. In political terms, Clarence was isolated. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his younger brother, had taken a different path, dutiful, reserved, and steadily rising in favor with Edward. By marrying Anne Neville and overseeing the affairs of the North, Richard consolidated both power and reputation. Where Clarence burned bridges, Richard built them. The contrast was not lost on the court. Increasingly, Clarence appeared as the unstable outlier among a royal house seeking stability after decades of war. At this point, Clarence's self-destructive instincts accelerated. Still furious over the execution of his household members, including Thomas Burdett and John Stacey, both accused of treason, Clarence began attacking the integrity of the king's legal system. In what would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, he made his criticisms public. He entered the royal council chamber uninvited and presented a document purporting to exonerate Burdett. He argued loudly and without restraint that Edward's ministers had fabricated evidence. He even implied that the king himself had been misled by corrupt counselors, or worse, that he had knowingly allowed innocent men to die. This outburst was a direct challenge to royal authority. It humiliated Edward before his lords and more dangerously suggested that Clarence might once again be preparing for sedition. The memory of his prior alliance with Warwick remained fresh. Now, with Burdett and Twinehoe as martyrs in his mind, Clarence appeared to be building a narrative of victimhood, of a duke wronged by a corrupt court positioned as the true defender of justice. Edward had tolerated much rebellion slander, even familial treachery. But this was different. Clarence's refusal to recognize legal authority, his execution of subjects without trial, and now his public defiance of the royal council amounted to insubordination of the highest order. The king was not merely dealing with a rival, he was facing a destabilizing force within the heart of his own dynasty. It was against this backdrop that Edward finally authorized Clarence's arrest. The process was clinical and silent. He was seized in Westminster and transferred to the Tower of London under heavy guard. No charges were immediately announced, and the court maintained a facade of normalcy. But everyone understood that the breach was now irreparable. Clarence's imprisonment was shrouded in secrecy. He was not allowed to communicate with the outside world, and his retinue was dismissed. The king assembled a council to determine what should be done, but the reality was already clear. Clarence had outlived his political utility and exhausted the patience of every faction at court. His own brother, whom he had betrayed and insulted, would now determine his fate. Even at this late hour, Clarence seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the gravity of his situation. Some accounts suggest he continued to write letters pleading his case, framing himself as a victim of courtly intrigue and foreign agents. He insisted that the astrologers had merely confirmed what he already knew, that his destiny was written in the stars, that he had been misjudged, misunderstood, maligned. But there would be no second pardon. No restoration. The final act had begun. The arrest of George, Duke of Clarence, marked a chilling turn in the reign of Edward IV. It was not the first time a powerful noble had been imprisoned in the Tower, but it was the first time since the Wars of the Roses had begun that a close male member of the royal family faced serious consideration of execution. Clarence's confinement was cloaked in silence. No official proclamations detailed his offenses, no trial date was publicly announced. Yet within court circles, the expectation was clear the king would make an example of his brother. The months following Clarence's imprisonment were characterized by a carefully orchestrated campaign to gather evidence and manage noble opinion. Clarence's previous offenses, his alliance with Warwick, his part in rebellion, the Anchoret Twinnyhoe affair, his seditious claims, and his unauthorized investigations into so-called conspiracies were compiled into a coherent indictment. More than just criminal charges, these formed a portrait of a man unfit to be trusted with power, deeply unstable and dangerously ungovernable. One of the most disturbing episodes from this period involved the informal inquiries Edward ordered among Clarence's former household. Testimonies gathered some willingly, others under threat painted a troubling picture. One servant described Clarence's late-night rants about the crown being stolen from him. Another recounted Clarence attempting to summon the devil through ritualistic practices reportedly conducted in a candle-lit room filled with astrological charts, bones, and torn pages from religious texts. These allegations, while difficult to corroborate, fully offered a disturbing insight into the kind of mental and emotional deterioration that had taken hold. Meanwhile, Edward's council convened a formal hearing in Parliament. This process, held behind closed doors in the House of Lords, was not a criminal trial in the modern sense. Clarence, as a prince of the blood, would be judged not by common law, but by the peerage under the king's direct authority. It was a political trial designed less to determine guilt than to legitimize a decision already made. Clarence was allowed no defense. The evidence against him was presented not by an impartial prosecutor, but by Edward himself. This extraordinary step of a monarch accusing his own brother before Parliament was without precedent in the Yorkist era. Edward's speech delivered in January 1478 detailed Clarence's unnatural behavior, his repeated disobedience, and his unrepentant treason. He cited the judicial murders Clarence had conducted, the false prophecies, the unauthorized communications with foreign courts, and his reckless public denunciations of the king's justice. Each act, Edward claimed, was an assault on royal authority and social order. The lords, bound by fealty and wary of provoking royal anger, found Clarence guilty of treason. The sentence, however, was not immediately carried out. Edward hesitated. For weeks after the conviction, Clarence remained imprisoned in the Tower, neither formally condemned nor pardoned. This delay sparked rumors. Some speculated that Edward was wavering, tormented by the gravity of executing his own brother. Others believed that Clarence's enemies, especially those in the Woodville faction, were pressuring the king to carry out the sentence before a potential reversal. Amid this uncertainty, the court turned toward distraction. In February 1478, just weeks after Clarence's conviction, Edward orchestrated a lavish double wedding. Two of his daughters, Elizabeth of York and Cecily, were betrothed in a grand ceremony meant to reinforce the monarchy's image of strength and unity. It was a deliberate display of control and continuity, carefully timed to overshadow the scandal brewing in the Tower. But not all could be hidden. Foreign observers in England, including Burgundian and Milanese envoys, reported that Clarence's execution was imminent. Their dispatches noted a climate of nervous expectation in London. Some streets near the Tower were patrolled more heavily. Others whispered that preparations for a private execution had already begun. It was also during this time that one of the most macabre legends of English history was born. According to several near-contemporary sources, George Plantagenet was not executed by sword or axe, as was customary for noble traitors. Instead, he was privately drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. The claim first appears in a chronicle written only a few years after Clarence's death, and was later repeated by Tudor historians with increasing flourish. Malmsey, a sweet wine imported from the Mediterranean, was reportedly Clarence's favorite drink, so much so that it became a grotesque symbol of poetic justice or indulgent punishment. The idea that Clarence requested to die this way as a final whim has been widely debated. Some historians suggest it was a metaphor that became literalized over time. Others argue it was an intentional act of irony, a death designed to reflect the decadence and delusion that had defined his final years. There is no official record in the rolls of Parliament or royal letters detailing the exact method of execution, which only deepened the mystery. What is certain is that Clarence was dead by mid-February 1478. His body was interred at Tewkesbury Abbey beside his wife Isabel and their short-lived child. His burial site, though fitting for a duke, was not widely publicized. No public mourning was declared, no elaborate ceremonies conducted. The entire process had been discreet, quietly executed to avoid scandal and prevent martyrdom. The psychological intensity of this event cannot be overstated. Clarence had once stood at the very center of English politics, brother to the king, and one of the few men who could plausibly claim the throne. His fall was not the result of a single crime, but of a persistent pattern of delusion, betrayal, and disregard for the structures that held the fragile Yorkist order together. In a darkly ironic twist, his death brought temporary calm to Edward's court. With Clarence gone, the most unpredictable variable in the royal family had been removed. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, rose steadily in influence, and Edward returned his focus to diplomacy and domestic consolidation. But beneath the surface, the execution of Clarence left a scar that would not fully heal. Among the most unsettling aspects of Clarence's downfall was the complete breakdown of familial bonds. Edward had spared others for lesser offenses, but not George. Whatever ties had once bound them, brotherhood, shared struggle, common blood had been severed, not by politics alone, but by fear and distrust. Clarence's final act, whether literal or symbolic, had been to drown in the very indulgence that marked his life ambition, without anchor pride, without prudence. By early 1478, the machinery of justice had finished its grim work. George, Duke of Clarence, was dead, his body entombed without pageantry, his name quietly removed from court discourse. Yet the ramifications of his downfall reverberated far beyond the walls of the Tower. For the Plantagenet dynasty, his execution represented not just the elimination of a rival, but a rupture in the very concept of royal fraternity. The man who had once fought beside Edward IV to secure the Yorkist crown had died by the king's will, his demise cloaked in secrecy, whispered about in foreign courts, and remembered with morbid fascination. Edward IV's personal role in his brother's conviction and death remains one of the most unsettling elements of the episode. The official record, limited and deliberately vague, offers no details on the king's emotional state. What is known is that Edward played the part of both accuser and final arbiter. He brought the charges before the Lords, he signed the warrant, and he authorized the means. That process, carried out away from public scrutiny, allowed Edward to maintain an image of lawful governance, while eliminating one of the most persistent threats to his authority. Clarence had not only betrayed his brother politically, he had humiliated him in front of the court, undermined his rule through conspiracy, and undermined the royal system of justice. His unauthorized executions, particularly the hanging of Anchoret Twiniho, exposed the vulnerability of royal law to noble overreach. And his public insistence on conspiracies, poisoners, and prophetic claims of destiny raised deeper fears. He was not merely disloyal, he was becoming ungovernable. To Edward, who had worked for over a decade to stabilize a kingdom battered by civil war, Clarence's continued presence was an unacceptable risk. Still, it is telling that Edward waited several weeks before authorizing the sentence. This delay suggests something more than political calculation. It points to personal torment. As king, he had executed traitors before, but never one bound to him by blood. The memory of their youth, of battles fought together, of family tragedy, and shared ambition could not be easily erased. Nor could the political precedent. If Edward could sanction the execution of his own brother, what protection existed for other nobles? What assurance could any peer of the realm truly possess? These questions unsettled the political elite. In the wake of Clarence's death, a quiet chill spread through the nobility. The spectacle had been private, but the implications were widely understood. The crown would no longer tolerate disobedience, no matter the offender's lineage. Few dared criticize the king openly, but private letters from the period suggest a surge in caution, even fear. Noble families began keeping more meticulous accounts of their interactions with the royal household. Ambitious courtiers tempered their rhetoric. The idea of the brother-executed king began to define Edward's image in subtle but inescapable ways. Clarence's family, particularly his children, suffered in the aftermath. His son Edward of Warwick was just 3 years old at the time of his father's death. Though of royal blood, the boy would grow up under a shadow of suspicion. His inheritance contested, his status uncertain. He was placed under supervision and eventually confined, first under Edward IV's reign and later by Henry VII, viewed less as a child and more as a potential threat. His sister Margaret fared somewhat better, marrying into the noble Pole family and achieving limited political prominence before meeting her own violent end under the Tudors. The sins of Clarence, it seemed, would haunt his line for generations. The psychological legacy within the royal family was more difficult to measure. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, emerged as the principal beneficiary of Clarence's fall. His marriage to Anne Neville, once bitterly contested by Clarence, now secured him access to the Warwick inheritance. Richard's power expanded dramatically, especially in the north. He became the most trusted military commander in Edward's service and, by many accounts, remained personally loyal to the king. Yet even Richard could not have missed the lesson of Clarence's fate. Blood ties were no protection against royal reprisal. Indeed, it is plausible that Clarence's downfall shaped Richard's later decisions. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Richard moved swiftly to seize the throne, declaring his nephews illegitimate and taking the crown as Richard III. Whether this was driven by ambition or necessity remains debated, but the precedent of Clarence was impossible to ignore. Richard had seen firsthand how a prince who was not king could be deemed a liability. In a world where proximity to power was indistinguishable from danger, perhaps he resolved to become the power himself. Meanwhile, among the wider population, Clarence's end entered folklore more quickly than policy. The story of the Malmsey wine, so grotesque and specific, captured the public imagination. It blurred the line between historical fact and moral allegory. Here was a prince who drowned not in a river or a moat, but in wine symbol of indulgence, vanity, and excess. The imagery was irresistible. It framed Clarence's fall not merely as a political failure, but as a form of poetic justice, a man who died as he lived suffocating on his own appetites. Some chroniclers, particularly in later Tudor accounts, delighted in exaggerating the legend. Clarence, they claimed, had laughed at his sentencing, choosing the wine cask with gallows humor. Others insisted he begged for mercy, sobbing in his cell, as he realized the king would not intervene. These conflicting accounts likely tell us more about the anxieties of their authors than the facts themselves. But they do underscore a key point. Clarence's story was never merely political. It became psychological, symbolic, a cautionary tale of ambition, unmoored from loyalty and family bonds twisted by power. What remains most disturbing is the sheer isolation Clarence faced in his final months. A man born into privilege, battle-tested, and once embraced as the heir presumptive to the English crown, died without a trial, without a defense, and without a farewell. There were no noble champions to defend him, no clerics to plead for his soul. Even in death, his name was handled with care, spoken quietly, almost shamefully, by a court eager to forget. And yet history did not forget. The fall of George Plantagenet became one of the earliest and most telling signs that the House of York, for all its victories, was not immune to internal decay. The very dynasty that had triumphed over Lancaster by promising order and unity had begun to devour itself. And Clarence, forever associated with betrayal and a barrel of wine, became its first major casualty from within. The execution of George, Duke of Clarence, might have seemed at first to bring a sense of finality to one of the most volatile chapters in the Yorkist era. But the consequences of his death extended far beyond 1478, foreshadowing the disintegration of Edward IV's carefully constructed order. The internal fracture within the House of York, once concealed beneath displays of military victory and dynastic marriage, was now laid bare. Clarence's elimination had not resolved the question of loyalty within the royal family. It had merely delayed its next eruption. For Edward IV, the years following his brother's death were marked by efforts to consolidate control and silence dissent. But these measures, though occasionally effective, could not restore what had been lost, the illusion that blood ties guaranteed stability. Clarence's death had broken that spell. Though his name was rarely mentioned, the memory of his trial and clandestine execution cast a long shadow over the court. If Edward could not reconcile with his own brother, despite years of shared warfare campaigns and family bonds, then what security could any noble hope for? This shift in political culture was subtle but transformative. Nobles no longer operated on assumptions of kinship privilege. Instead, they began to calculate survival based solely on utility and proximity to royal favor. This new reality intensified the factionalism that had long plagued the court. Old rivalries between the Woodvilles and the traditional northern nobility, between Edward's in-laws and the remnants of Warwick's former allies, now operated with greater urgency and less restraint. Clarence had once occupied a middle ground between these camps. With him gone, balance gave way to competition. The psychological toll on Edward IV, though less documented, should not be overlooked. In the years after Clarence's execution, the king's health declined rapidly. His once energetic court became more reserved, even somber. Chroniclers noted his increasing weight, his reliance on pleasure as distraction, and his retreat from governance in favor of trusted officials. By the early 1480s, Edward was rarely seen in public for long periods, and when he did appear, he was notably changed, older, grayer, and more prone to reflection than command. Then in April 1483, Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40. His heir, Edward V, was just 12 years old. The question of succession, once settled by war, then complicated by Clarence's betrayal, reopened in the most dangerous way. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector. In a matter of weeks, the boy king was seized, his legitimacy questioned, and Parliament declared him illegitimate. Richard seized the throne as Richard III. The princes in the Tower, the sons of Edward IV, including Clarence's nephew, disappeared. This sequence of events was not just the result of political ambition. It was also a direct legacy of Clarence's fall. The precedent had been set, blood alone was not a shield, and the logic of power would always override sentiment. Richard's usurpation was brutal, but in many ways it mirrored the cold logic Edward had employed against Clarence. If a brother could be executed for disloyalty, why not a nephew displaced for weakness? Clarence's own son, Edward of Warwick, now orphaned and politically voiceless, became a pawn in this dynastic struggle. Though technically next in line under traditional male preference primogeniture, he was passed over entirely. Richard III placed him under tight confinement, aware that any attempt to claim the boy's name or cause could be used against him. Under the succeeding Tudor regime, the boy would eventually be tried and executed by Henry VII, who feared Warwick might become a rallying point for Yorkist loyalists. Margaret Pole, Clarence's daughter, fared better for a time. Elevated to the peerage and made Countess of Salisbury, she became one of the last surviving Plantagenets. But during Henry VIII's reign, her royal blood became a liability. In 1541, at the age of 67, she was executed on a flimsy pretext, her death so gruesome that eyewitnesses recorded the headsman requiring multiple strikes to complete the execution. In this final act, the long shadow of Clarence's fall claimed its last prominent victim. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Clarence's story is its grotesque symbolism. The barrel of Malmsey wine, whether literal or apocryphal, became a potent image in English folklore. It spoke to more than indulgence or irony. It represented the intersection of luxury and death, of royal excess and mortal consequence. No matter how powerful or well-born, Clarence's death showed that privilege offered no protection when trust dissolved. It was a medieval morality tale etched in royal blood and sweetened wine. Clarence's downfall also exposed something deeper about the nature of monarchy in the late 15th century. The English crown was not a stable institution. It was a contest of personalities, factions, and survival instincts. Clarence's psychological collapse, his obsessions with prophecy, poison, and betrayal, reflected not just personal instability, but the broader anxieties of a noble class, trapped in an age of uncertainty. The Wars of the Roses had begun as a question of succession. By the time Clarence was executed, they had become a study in paranoia. In retrospect, George Plantagenet's trajectory is uniquely tragic. He had been given every advantage: a royal birth, a powerful marriage, access to wealth and influence. Yet his ambition outpaced his judgment, and his grievances consumed his reason. Had he been content with a secondary role, trusted brother, loyal commander, reliable noble, he might have flourished. But Clarence could not accept limitation. In his mind, destiny had been denied and the crown had been misplaced. That belief proved fatal. The life and death of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, stands as one of the most chilling cautionary episodes in English dynastic history. His execution, quiet, concealed, and possibly carried out in a vat of sweet Malmsey wine, was more than an act of royal discipline. It was a rupture that exposed the psychological fragility of the House of York and the corrosive power of mistrust at the heart of monarchy. What began as a promising princely career ended in silence, spectacle, and whispered legend. Clarence's fall set a precedent that England's kings and their rivals would not forget. It demonstrated that even a prince of royal blood could not escape the consequences of disobedience, that familial closeness could dissolve under the weight of perceived treachery. In an age where the line between loyalty and betrayal was measured not in words but in actions and allegiances, Clarence tested every boundary and found each one in the end lethal. But his downfall also revealed the psychological pressures that defined the late Plantagenet world. Clarence was not merely ambitious, he was surrounded by shifting loyalties, half-trusted allies, and a court in constant flux. His mental deterioration, likely exacerbated by grief, political failure, and personal resentment, made him a mirror of the larger instability that had plagued England since the wars began. His obsession with prophecy and signs was not madness in isolation, it was a symptom of a political culture where destiny and suspicion held equal sway. Edward IV's decision to execute his brother remains one of the most haunting in the annals of English kingship. Whether it was a reluctant necessity or a calculated choice, the act eroded the very ideal of dynastic unity. It may have secured the throne in the short term, but it destabilized the Yorkist legacy in the long term. When Edward died unexpectedly just 5 years later, the House of York was fatally unprepared. The execution of Clarence had removed one rival, but it had not eliminated the deeper rot. In the decades that followed, the legacy of Clarence's demise continued to haunt the English monarchy. His children, Edward of Warwick and Margaret Pole, died as victims of dynastic paranoia. His name, whispered with a mixture of horror and fascination, became emblematic of ambition turned inward, of family turned fatal. His story blurred the lines between history and legend, reality and symbolism. And yet beneath the myth of the wine barrel, beyond the chronicles and Tudor embellishments, remains a sobering historical truth. George Plantagenet was a man destroyed not only by his actions, but by the system that both elevated and entrapped him. He lived in a world where loyalty could not be trusted, where ambition was necessary for survival, and where even a brother's mercy could run dry. His final moment, obscured by secrecy, remembered for its grotesque detail, encapsulates the perilous dance of power in the twilight of Plantagenet England. It serves as a lasting reminder that in the brutal theater of monarchy, those who reach for the crown must first learn where its shadow falls.